She was called the Ivory Queen of Soul, a voice so powerful it could silence an audience with a single note. And yet her final days were spent in silence, away from the crowds who once adored her. Teena Marie's story in her last chapter is not just about music, but about the haunting truth of how life can unravel behind closed doors. To the public, she was timeless, still glowing with the aura of a legend whose songs carved their way into history. But behind the spotlight, shadows grew longer. She had spent years battling the demands of a career that gave her everything and took even more in return. Fame came with exhaustion, success with isolation, and applause with the quiet sound of loneliness when the curtains fell. Her final days carry the weight of a tragedy that feels less like the ending of a career and more like the breaking of a soul that had carried too much for too long. The story begins with the physical toll of years in the music industry. Teena Marie was known for her incredible energy on stage, her ability to belt notes with raw power night after night. But what audiences did not see was the wear that constant performance, travel, and pressure left on her body. Sources close to her whispered about chronic pain, the kind that drains not only strength but spirit. She had suffered seizures in her later years, a cruel reminder that even the strongest voices are not immune to fragility. Doctors advised her to rest, to slow down, but slowing down was not something she understood. Music was not just her career, it was her heartbeat. To stop performing would feel like death itself, and so she pushed forward even as her body begged her to stop. That determination was admirable, but it came with a price she would pay in her final days. Her family, especially her daughter, was the one anchor that kept her grounded during these painful times. But even love was not enough to shield her from the darkness of failing health, and emotionally, she carried battles the public rarely saw. Teena Marie had lived through an industry that was often unforgiving, especially for a white woman stepping into the deeply rooted world of soul and R&B. Though she earned her title as the Ivory Queen of Soul through sheer talent and respect from peers, she also faced criticism, doubt, and the constant need to prove herself. These struggles left scars, and over the years, those scars deepened. In interviews, she would occasionally reveal glimpses of the emotional weight she carried, failed relationships, betrayals, the strain of being both an artist and a single mother. Behind the glamour of her career was a woman who had endured heartbreak after heartbreak, yet still gave the world every ounce of love she had through her music. In her last days, those heartbreaks caught up with her, leaving her more vulnerable than she ever allowed the stage lights to reveal. Silent battles of the mind. She spent more time at home in her final days, away from the noise of the industry. Friends described her as reflective, as if she knew the end was approaching. She spoke more about legacy, about wanting to be remembered not just for her voice, but for her courage to stand where few dared to stand. These conversations paint a heartbreaking picture of a woman preparing, consciously or unconsciously, to leave the world behind. The tragedy of her final days is that she carried this awareness quietly, never fully sharing how much pain she truly endured. On December 26, 2010, the world would lose her suddenly, and the heartbreak of her final days became a permanent scar in music history. The way she died, peacefully in her sleep at home, only deepens the sadness of her story. There was no stage, no spotlight, no farewell tour, just silence. A silence that echoed louder than any note she ever sang. Fans around the globe mourned, stunned that such a vibrant force could vanish overnight. But for those who knew her closely, the signs were already there. The struggles, the pain, the quiet withdrawal from the world. Her final days were not marked by fame, but by fragility, and that fragility is what makes her story so haunting. The heartbreaking truth about Teena Marie's final days becomes clearer when you look at the quiet struggles that unfolded behind her closed doors. For decades, she was seen as unstoppable, the woman who broke barriers and sang her way into the soul of America. But in her last chapter, she faced something no audience could see: the crushing weight of exhaustion, both physical and emotional. For years, she had carried her career almost like a shield, giving fans every ounce of her spirit, but in return, it left her isolated when she needed strength the most. This was not just the story of an artist fading, it was the story of a fighter who had run out of battles to win. The seizures she suffered in the months leading up to her death were more than just medical emergencies. They were warnings her body was giving her, signals that the years of stress, performance, and pressure had finally taken their toll. She had collapsed once in public, sending waves of fear through fans who saw their idol suddenly fragile. Though she survived those incidents, the impact stayed with her. Friends recalled how she became more cautious afterward, yet she refused to give up her music completely. Music was her lifeline, the one thing that gave her joy despite the pain. But that same devotion may have kept her from giving her body the rest it desperately needed. In those final days, she was balancing on a razor's edge, torn between the artist who lived for the stage and the woman whose health was slipping away. Her emotional struggles were just as heavy. Teena Marie had lived through heartbreaks that never truly healed. She carried the grief grief of lost love, the scars of betrayal, and the loneliness of navigating an industry that was often cruel. Though she smiled for cameras and kept her voice strong, those closest to her say that her private moments revealed a woman haunted by memories. She was reflective, often speaking of her life in the past tense, as if she sensed that time was running out. These reflections were not bitter. She still spoke with love about her career, her fans, and her daughter, but they carried an undertone of sadness, a quiet acceptance that she had endured more pain than most people ever knew. Despite these struggles, her love for her daughter kept her moving forward. She was devoted, determined to give her child stability even when her own life was filled with instability. In her last days, she spent more time at home, focusing on family rather than fame. The world saw her as a superstar, but in her heart, she was a mother first. This duality, the legend on stage and the vulnerable woman at home, was what made her so human, so relatable, and so tragically misunderstood. She poured everything she had into her daughter, wanting to leave behind not just memories of music but the legacy of love. And perhaps, in those final days, she found peace in the moments when she could simply be Mom, and not the Ivory Queen of Soul. Yet even in the safety of her home, the weight of her declining health never left her. Nights grew longer, pain grew heavier, and her energy faded. Still, she carried herself with grace, rarely letting others see just how much she was suffering. Friends who visited described her as warm and welcoming, but with a quietness that had not been there before, as if she was saving her strength for the moments that mattered most. That quietness, in hindsight, was the silence of a woman who knew her story was approaching its end. On the night she passed, there were no flashing lights, no microphones, no audience to cheer her name. It was just silence. The tragedy of that silence is that it replaced a voice that had given the world so much. And in that silence, the heartbreaking truth of her final days became undeniable. Teena Marie was not just a superstar lost too soon. She was a woman who had carried more pain than the world ever realized, and whose final days revealed the fragile humanity behind the legend. Her final days cannot be understood without stepping back into the world she once dominated, because it was both the stage of her greatest triumphs and the source of her deepest wounds. Teena Marie carried the title of Ivory Queen of Soul proudly, but it came with a weight that pressed harder as the years went by. She was one of the few who crossed barriers in music, loved and accepted in a genre where outsiders rarely lasted. But even with respect, the pressure to always prove herself never faded. That constant battle, invisible to fans who only saw the sparkle, left her weary in ways that fame could never heal. By the time her final days came, the echoes of that lifelong struggle still surrounded her like ghosts she could not escape. One of the greatest burdens she carried was the tension between art and industry. Teena Marie was not a manufactured star, she was an artist in the truest sense, pouring her soul into every note. But the music business is often merciless, caring less about art and more about profit. Over the years, she fought legal battles and industry disputes that drained her emotionally. She had to fight for her creative control, to secure her place in a world that often tried to box her in. These fights were victories for her artistry, but every victory came at a cost. The stress of those battles left marks that no one could see but that she carried quietly into her last days. Even as she grew weaker, she still spoke about music with passion. But there was a shadow behind her words, a recognition that the industry she loved had taken as much as it had given. Her relationship with fans during her final days was bittersweet. She remained beloved, admired as a pioneer whose music touched millions. Fans celebrated her resilience, often seeing her as a symbol of strength. Yet the irony is that while she inspired others, she was struggling to keep herself whole. Appearances grew fewer, and when she did show up, fans noticed she seemed more fragile than before. The powerful voice was still there, but the body carrying it was tired. The cheers that once gave her energy now seemed to remind her of how far she had come and how heavy the journey had been. In those last days, the love of her fans was both a comfort and a reminder of the demands that had worn her down. Her personal world was equally complicated. The devotion to her daughter kept her grounded, but being both mother and music legend came with challenges most could never imagine. Balancing the endless demands of her career with the responsibilities of motherhood left her stretched thin. Those close to her describe moments of deep reflection in her final days, where she seemed torn between gratitude for her blessings and sorrow for the struggles she could not erase. She often spoke about wanting her daughter to understand her sacrifices, to see that everything she endured had been for love. Yet there was also fear of leaving too soon, of not being there to guide her through life's hardest moments. That fear weighed heavily on her, making her final days not just a physical decline, but an emotional struggle between holding on and letting go. Even the way she faced her illness reflected her character. Teena Marie did not publicly complain or lean into sympathy. She carried her pain with quiet dignity, rarely showing the world how much she was suffering. Friends recalled how she would still smile, still crack jokes, still carry warmth in her voice even when she was weak. That strength was admirable, but it also made her struggles more invisible. By keeping her pain private, the world was left shocked when she passed, unprepared for the truth of how much she had endured. Her silence, in many ways, was her final performance, the ability to protect her image and her family from the full weight of her suffering, even at the very end. The third layer of Teena Marie's final days shows us the tragedy of a woman who gave everything to her art and carried the hidden cost of that gift until her last breath. She was a legend who fought battles no audience ever saw, who smiled through pain, and who left the world far too soon. The tragedy is not just that she died, but that she died while still carrying dreams, burdens, and love she had not yet finished giving. That is what makes her final days heartbreaking. They remind us that behind every legend is a human being, fragile, vulnerable, and ultimately mortal. The fourth stage of Teena Marie's final days is where the tragedy feels most human, because it is no longer about the stage or the headlines. It is about the quiet reality of a woman facing her last moments in a world that had taken so much from her. She had built a career on strength, on defying odds, on being a force no one could ignore. Yet when the final curtain began to fall, what remained was not the legend, but the fragile woman beneath the crown of the Ivory Queen of Soul. Those close to her describe a softness in her final days, a gentleness that came as if she knew the end was near and had accepted it in her own way. It was not surrender, it was peace, a quiet resignation that even the strongest voices eventually must rest. Her health struggles grew heavier as the weeks passed. The seizures she had endured were not just isolated events. They were signs of something much larger, signals that her body could no longer endure the weight it had carried for decades. She was often fatigued, sometimes unable to move with the energy fans remembered. Yet she refused to let despair consume her. She still tried to smile for her daughter, to offer comfort even as she was the one who needed it most. Friends say she spoke often about legacy in those last days, about wanting her daughter to know she was proud of her, about wanting her fans to remember the love behind her music. These conversations reveal a woman who was not afraid of death itself, but afraid of leaving too soon, of leaving unfinished love behind. Her home became her sanctuary in those final days, a sharp contrast to the loud arenas and stages that had defined her life. It was there, away from the cameras, that the final chapter unfolded. The house was filled not with noise, but with silence broken only by soft conversations, memories, and the hum of everyday life. For a woman who had lived so publicly, the intimacy of her final setting was almost poetic. She did not pass under flashing lights or in front of screaming crowds. She passed in the place where she felt safest, surrounded by the people who truly mattered. That is the cruel irony of her story. She spent her life giving everything to the world, yet in her last moments, she finally took something back for herself: peace. Emotionally, those last days were layered with both gratitude and grief. Gratitude for the love she had received, for the chance to have lived her dream, for the family who stood beside her. But grief for the time she knew she would not have. She often spoke of music she still wanted to record, of ideas she still had inside her. She carried melodies in her mind even as her body weakened. That unfulfilled potential makes her death all the more tragic. She left with songs unsung, dreams unrealized, and love unspoken. For her fans, the loss was sudden, but for her it was a gradual fading, a quiet awareness that her time was slipping through her fingers. What makes this stage of her story most heartbreaking is how much of her struggle went unseen. To the outside world, she remained a symbol of strength, a legend who had conquered barriers. But behind closed doors, she was simply Teena, a mother, a woman in pain, a soul preparing to say goodbye. There were no headlines announcing her suffering, no public outcry before her death. Her struggles were private, and that privacy made the shock of her passing even sharper. It was as if the world had been lulled into believing she would always be there, her voice forever echoing, until suddenly she was gone. The fourth layer of her final days reminds us that legends are human too. Teena Marie, with all her power and glory, faced the same silence we all must face. And in that silence, her story turned from triumph to tragedy, from music to memory. Her passing was not just the end of a career. It was the end of a life that had given more love, more passion, and more soul than most people could ever hope to give. And that is what makes her final days so unbearably heartbreaking. The final chapter of Teena Marie's story is perhaps the most haunting, because it forces the world to reconcile the image of a legend with the reality of a woman whose time ended too soon. In the days leading up to her passing, there was an almost eerie calm in her life. Friends described her as reflective, as if she was reviewing the chapters of her journey one last time. She spoke more about gratitude, about the blessings she had experienced, but also about the struggles that had carved scars no one else could see. It was as though she knew her days were numbered, and instead of resisting, she embraced the chance to leave quietly, surrounded not by the noise of fame but by the silence of home. That silence, once a stranger to a woman who lived on stage, became her final companion. The day she died was like any other. Nothing dramatic, no grand announcement of the tragedy about to strike. She went to bed in her own home, the same house where she had laughed with her daughter, written music, and tried to find peace away from the industry's demands. That night, she simply did not wake up. Her death was sudden, but it was also strangely gentle, as if life had decided to let her rest after years of struggle. The contrast is devastating. A woman whose voice had shaken arenas, whose songs had defined decades, slipping away in silence. When the news broke, fans across the globe were stunned. The world had lost the Ivory Queen of Soul, and the tragedy was not only in her passing but in the way it happened. So sudden, so final, so silent. The shock of her death revealed just how unprepared the world was to lose her. Social media flooded with tributes. Fans shared memories of the first time they heard her voice, and fellow artists expressed heartbreak over the loss of someone who had not only made history but had inspired them personally. For many, it felt as though a light had been turned off in the music world. Her songs still played, her voice still filled speakers, but the woman behind them was gone forever. That permanence of loss is what made it unbearable. People clung to her music as if holding on to it could bring her back, but deep down, everyone knew the silence she left behind would never be filled. What makes her final days especially tragic is the contrast between the legend the world saw and the woman she truly was. On stage, she was larger than life, a powerhouse who seemed unstoppable. In private, she was fragile, human, and vulnerable, enduring struggles most fans never imagined. She carried physical pain from seizures, emotional scars from heartbreak, and the loneliness of someone who gave everything to the world yet still felt the emptiness that fame could not cure. Her last days remind us that legends do not live forever, that even the strongest voices are silenced by time. The tragedy is not just that Teena Marie died, it is that she died with dreams still left inside her, songs still unsung, and love still left to give. And yet even in tragedy, her legacy endures. Her final days, though heartbreaking, did not erase the decades of brilliance she gave to music. Instead, they highlight her humanity, reminding the world that behind every legend is a person who bleeds, who breaks, who eventually fades. The Ivory Queen of Soul may have left in silence, but her music ensures she will never truly be gone. Her voice, etched into the history of soul and R&B, continues to echo, a reminder of the beauty she gave and the pain she carried. That is the tragedy and the gift of her story. Her final days broke hearts, but her life left a legacy too powerful to ever be forgotten. Her story ends not with the roar of applause, but with the echo of silence. A silence so heavy it reminds us how fragile even the strongest voices can be. Teena Marie gave the world everything. Her passion, her soul, her truth. And in return, she carried battles most of us never saw. Her final days stripped away the glamour and left behind a heartbreaking truth. Ivory Queen of Soul was not only a legend, she was human, and humans break even when they shine the brightest. Her death was sudden, her absence unbearable, but her legacy is eternal. Every note she sang, every lyric she wrote, every ounce of love she poured into her music still breathes today. Teena Marie's life was not defined by her tragic end, but by the beauty she created along the way. And though she left this world too soon, her voice remains a reminder that even in tragedy, there is a kind of immortality. Legends may fall silent, but they never truly disappear.